Hello, everyone. This is An American Atheist. This is episode 103. You can find notes for the show at anamericanatheist.org/episode 103. It's been a while. I guess you can take solace that I still don't believe in God. My name is Tom. I'm joined by Chris Lazare and Chris Thielen. You share that sentiment?
That we're joined by us? Or that we yes,
that we don't believe in God.
Yeah.
I don't know. I almost was convinced. Megyn Kelly almost had me convinced.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I assume God's white, according.
Yeah.
So on this episode, we have a very sort of past due discussion on Sam Harris's new pamphlet called Free Will. And if you haven't read it, that's fine. We're going to talk generally about free will. I think how free will is a problem in society, how humanists might deal with the problem, how it's been a religious problem, and discuss a lot of the points that Sam Harris brings up in that work. I also want to point out that I should point to the fact that Sam Harris has had a lot of criticism lately for his positions as a figurehead in the atheist movement, and we don't necessarily endorse his ideas in any other spectrum, but I think his pamphlet here has some smart ideas to talk about. Okay, so first of all, why is this a problem? What is this whole free will argument?
Yeah, the basic argument against free will is that it doesn't really exist. That what we call free will is really the illusion of, and this is from Harris, but I generally agree with this. It's the illusion of the thoughts that arise within our head and us being conscious of thoughts arising within our head, but it doesn't really make logical sense for us to be free agents or, demigods just creating thoughts out of thin air, essentially.
I felt like there was a whole underlying motion of cause and effect here. Everything kind of has its own reasons that's what creates your own thoughts, which leads to your actions. So, I mean, it's not really just you kind of saying that, all right, I want to drink this apple juice. There's a reason why you want to drink this apple juice that you are unconscious of. You have no idea why you want to drink this apple juice. You just know that you want to drink this apple juice. So he would argue that you don't make that decision to drink that apple juice.
It's a mechanical view of the universe, really, that deterministic mechanical view that everything fits together, and the fact that you don't understand exactly why thoughts arise doesn't mean that there's not a very, straightforward mechanical explanation for it. That's essentially the argument against free will.
Yeah, it seems like if you have a pre-existing, let's say you freeze the universe in one state, doesn't it seem like if you unfroze it, it's just always going to repeat that next pattern in the next 5 seconds? You know what I mean? So isn't your brain kind of like that as well?
Right. And this, I believe, is called determinism, right? That exact view, the idea that if you sort of know the position and direction of all particles, you can rewind and fast forward, and the whole thing will play out with perfect logic.
This is actually a big religious topic, too, because a lot of religions used to be purely deterministic. They said that everything was, predetermined by God, and this used to be a pretty big religious debate. It's not really so much anymore, especially in the Western world. But I think it's interesting that they had that take on it. And it's kind of weird too. Like, God is all knowing, and when you apply that concept to it, it's kind of bizarre. So, is there just then one linear path in time under that theology, and God knows what it is going to be? Are there infinite paths under that theology? So I think that most religions shift towards free will too now, because there's this idea of sin and punishment and redemption. So I think it functions better under that narrative to have free will. And I think this also springboards into a point that Harris has about, what are the implications of not having free will? He says that our policies wouldn't work. For example, our criminal justice system would not work because it functions on a system of, in particular, retributive justice, similar to the religious context, where that's the kind of, there's multiple reasons why the criminal justice system punishes people. One is retributive. It means you did a bad thing, so we're going to do this to you, rather than a rehabilitative or a bunch of other reasons why. There's also another reason too, for example, sometimes we just isolate someone who did a crime just to protect society. That's kind of a different notion than retributive justice.
Right. And isn't there
So what
also
do you guys?
there's justice and well, this is maybe not justice, but there's also justice as a deterrent for crime, right? The existence of a justice system stops a certain amount of people from doing something they would have otherwise done in a anarchist society, right?
There's two types of deterrence. There's general deterrence, which is you punish this one person so the whole society says like, oh, I'm not going to do that. I think that's mostly what he's talking about here. And there's specific deterrence also, which I guess is implicated, where you punish someone, you say that specific person is not going to do this again.
Right. On the subject of the criminal justice system, he quotes a U.S. Supreme Court decision from 1978. It says, the U.S. Supreme Court has called free will a universal and persistent foundation for our system of law, distinct from a deterministic view of human conduct that is inconsistent with the underlying precepts of our criminal justice system. So that's the Supreme Court, in the late 70s, basically saying that a lack of free will, this deterministic universe or fatalistic universe, depending on your view, is not compatible with the way that we do justice.
I totally get what he's saying here, except I don't really agree with his implications.
So lay it out.
Because
What does he mean exactly?
if you're functioning on the system of you're going to punish someone for doing X and you do so, if they don't really have free will, they just would have done X. First of all, it's a culpability thing, right? Because we're assigning blame to these people on a retributive sense. If it's not really their fault because they didn't really have a choice in the matter, then our system is out of whack. He also Sam Harris lays out a few different criminal acts where a woman dies. For example, you look at a situation differently based on the motive and intent and rationality behind the person. So if someone just kills someone because they had, for example, a brain tumor, or someone's a minor and kills someone, we look at all those things differently. And a lot of it has to do with their intent and ability to form intent. See, we have such a good appearance of free will. I don't think it matters, because if there is a proper deterrent effect, then it doesn't matter, because you're still affected by it, even if you didn't choose to be affected by it. It's still going to determine your behavior potentially.
That would be the position that Daniel Dennett and the compatibilists take, right? I mean, because even if you are unconscious of these decisions, it is still you yourself that is making these decisions, correct?
Potentially, that could be true. But it probably isn't even in the case in Sam Harris's camp, because you still receive that information and it's going to affect you, even if you had no choice on it one way later on or at that point or ever, because that's just a different stimulus that's been introduced into how you act.
So I guess the real question is, because Sam Harris brings this up, if someone basically would never have committed a murder, does commit a murder, and it's because of a brain tumor that grows in just the right area, of your frontal lobe or where it needs to grow, that causes you to be violent, and they discovered this, should you be punishing that person? Is that person actually responsible?
I think those raise some deep philosophical issues. I mean, to me, when I read that and I say, okay, if I'm that doctor and I could find that tumor did in fact lead to this individual carrying out this crime, say murder, I would think that if I knew for a fact that this tumor was the reason why this person did that, I don't think that person should be punished in that sense.
Right.
Because
I was going to say, in the same way that if you die of having a bad heart, people blame the bad heart and they don't say you committed suicide, right?
Right.
It was it's this sort of aspect of your mechanics that caused it.
Exactly. And I mean that this was the whole idea, because I mean it creates this idea of compassion, and that's exactly what Sam Harris says. I mean, if we understand that all our bodies, all of us, are susceptible to these types of behavior regardless of how good we think we are. For example, the Dalai Lama, could even end up murdering somebody at one point, because these could be situations that snowball into him murdering somebody, hypothetically.
Right.
But if we understand why that individual is killing somebody, or why that individual is violent, I think if we understand that, it creates this idea of empathy, and I think that we would understand it, and we would be less inclined to harm that person in a penitentiary. We would be looking to rehabilitate them, like with drugs or something.
Do you agree with that, Tom?
There's a lot of things. What do you mean specifically? Do I agree with the assessment of assigning blame to that person with a brain tumor or not?
Yeah.
I don't. I think it's an extremely low culpability, if not none at all.
Well, I mean, let's expand though a little bit, and so forget the brain tumor because there seems to be a lot of if I could determine this, et cetera, et cetera. What about, they talked about environmental factors. What about people who had terrible childhoods, people who weren't educated properly, people who are in bad situations where they aren't able to make money and they aren't able to have a stable, living situation. They're stressed out. They're so on,
Well,
what about that? Aren't those factors from the outside world?
Sure. Harris also distinguishes this in terms of kind of a political ideology, which I think is actually really appropriate. I do take that point of view. I do think that perhaps even if there is free will or not, you're going to have a limited subset of people who come from those really poor backgrounds and terrible backgrounds who actually do quite well. It reminds me of Gladwell's work where he talks about people who overcome adversity in his books. And Malcolm Gladwell, I believe his name is. And because of the adversity they overcame, they became better people. But for a good chunk of people, this adversity just, puts them down the wrong path. Mm-hmm. And Harris points out that a conservative kind of mentality, tries to say without pointing fingers to it, right? A conservative kind of mentality of this pull yourself up by your own bootstraps idea is incompatible with this free will conclusion, right? Because that's not really how it works, right? And so I was already of the point that, I recognize that's the problem. I don't know if we can't punish those people who perform that way because it serves a purpose. I think that's a huge problem is that people are directly a result of their environment. You can look at tons of data to conclude that as well.
And it just so happens the conservatives that he is arguing are probably Republicans and are probably highly religious. And he also, he says religious fetish. So I think he's just kind of just taking jabs at it. But you see it all in the conservative political ideology. If you work hard, then you will be successful. And that's not necessarily the case because, plenty of people who work hard, those people who are flipping burgers at McDonald's, they're working in a hot kitchen, 40 plus hours probably, two jobs, working really, really hard for several years, and they don't make a gain. If anything, they lose,
Right.
They lose steps. So this whole idea of, free will, I think it is very opportunistic for these conservatives to latch on to this idea and slap it on to the whole society and say, well, if you fail, it's because you yourself suck. It has nothing to do with your conditions. It has nothing to do with your education, your family, your upbringing. None of that matters. It all matters about yourself. But we understand that not to be true. And even without this argument of free will, you could just see by the numbers, there is a small subset of people who get out, like your Oprahs. But there aren't. How many Oprahs are there? How many Jay-Z's are there?
Right.
Most of those people just fall in through the cracks. So it's not about how you operate. It's just about a matter of luck.
A good question that Harris talks about is if there isn't free will, what role does responsibility play?
I think that we could still be responsible as individuals, especially if we want to go back to the criminal justice system. We could be responsible in the sense that we won't lock people up for addictions. We won't lock people up for crimes that could be caused by, for example, a tumor in their brain.
What about in the case of people who do have addictions, though, of, say, taking away freedom, say, locking them up and forcing them to get clean? Would that be a view that is compatible with a lack of free will? Wouldn't that simply be saying, we're going to be a little authoritarian here, but we're going to take a shortcut because we know how the world works, and you shouldn't have the the perception of free will to try and quit on your own?
I think they would have to exhibit the behavior of addiction first. I don't think we could go and say your mom is. I don't know if that's the question that you're asking me, but I don't think we could go and say, because we know addiction runs through families. Mm-hmm. So I don't think we could go and say, okay, your mom's an addict. We're going to take your son and put him in an early prevention, a substance prevention program. I don't think we need to do that. But if we're talking about somebody who's already exhibiting the signs of addiction, then I think we could, instead of locking them up, putting them through the ringer, we could rehabilitate them. Same thing for violence.
Right.
If we know that you could test this in social sciences. You could test to see who's violent, what groups of people are violent, what their situations are. If you're poor, you're probably going to be violent because you have to eat, right? You resort to violence, you resort to crime. So you could try and mitigate those factors through government programs. Maybe
Right.
greater safety nets, healthcare, food programs, education, things like that. Right now, I think we see an increase in all those because those are the first things that are on the chopping block, as opposed to being the first things to help mitigate all these types of other factors that lead to people being put in jail.
I want to point out, before it gets too far away from it, is the Gladwell book I was talking about was David and Goliath. He also wrote Outliers. In case people were concerned about reference.
Yeah, he's a pretty famous writer, actually.
Yeah. I think that Sam Harris, when he makes this point, at the end of this all, he says, well, you know what? I really think I'm a better person because of this recognition that I have no free will, because I sympathize with people more, because I recognize that they didn't really have too much of a choice in the matter. So we talk about all this stuff about where people come from and how they can't really get out of it. It sort of improves your understanding of where they come from. Mm-hmm. So at the one hand, he's saying, well, if we didn't have free will, that recognition would spiral our society into oblivion, is kind of what he's saying. And to make the point that this is a serious issue. But then at the same time says, well, actually, I think I'm a better person personally because of it. So I think that's a little inconsistent, in my opinion.
This is just like when someone, sort of becomes an atheist or is considering losing faith in God. One thing that is frightening is, the idea that the universe will no longer make sense. But the truth of the matter is that as a religious person, if you decide that you have been wrong the whole time and that, the atheistic worldview is for you, you haven't changed the metaphysics of the universe by doing so. Everything that once was still is, and that's how the world's going to keep operating. So the same thing goes with free will. If you suddenly decide that, you agree with Sam Harris's arguments or you agree with what you're hearing from us and that free will doesn't exist, it doesn't negate the illusion of free will and the things that has done for you. That's still a mechanism that you can rely upon. It's not as though your atoms will fly apart the moment you truly don't believe in free will anymore.
Well, there's a couple things I actually want to stack on to why he thinks that free will doesn't exist. He mentioned a couple studies. One study was where a subject would press a button, and 6 to 7 seconds before they make the conscious decision to press that button, the people doing the study could already tell which button that person was going to press. So they knew what button that person was going to press before that person even made a conscious decision about which button to press.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's lots of interesting ideas as to why people don't seem to have free will. But I also think that not having conscious access to your thoughts does not mean that you don't have free will.
This is the Daniel Dennett position.
Yeah, I sort of get that.
Harris writes, the fact that we cannot always be subjectively aware of the causes of our actions does not negate free will because our unconscious neurophysiology is just as much us as our conscious thoughts are. That's the view in summation, and that's the compatibilist view. People ignore some of the signs that free will doesn't exist, and impulses are one of them. Impulses and bad habits are both violations of free will. It's people doing things that they ultimately don't want to have done, but did anyway.
Right.
A really good point and a really good way to illustrate it that somewhat convinces me. I mean,
we should talk about compatibilism, too.
Sure. I'm not necessarily a compatibilist. I just don't – I sort of lean towards the position that free will doesn't exist, but I don't know if he's fully proven it to my satisfaction yet. Is this idea of, well, okay, let's say you need to use the restroom and you're sitting down, right? It's not really your choice, I guess, whether or not you had to use the restroom. But it is certainly you would think it's your choice when you would use it, right?
Yeah,
but why one moment over the other? And so I think when he goes through those examples, it's very compelling to me is why, there's just something in your brain that triggered that said, okay, well, at this moment, this is when I'm going to go get up and do that.
I think it's hard for people for them to get their head around the fact that all these decisions are taking a large, we have to kind of step back from it. So we have to look at the cause and effects of these decisions that we're making. But these decisions are happening so fast that it appears that we have this free will.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's one experiment he cites by Benjamin Libet, which is the one where he uses EEG to detect motor activity before a person has decided to move, and that one only has a head start of 300 milliseconds, a third of a second. Now, Tom,
Very
I feel
interesting.
like you sort of hinted that maybe you understand a little bit of the compatibilist view. I mean, do you have to reject the idea of a deterministic mechanical universe to believe in free will?
Well, let me first explain generally again what compatibilists are. I guess it's what Sam Harris puts as the only rational alternative to fully giving in to say that there is no free will whatsoever and it's merely an illusion. He quotes the position, I believe this is Dennett, he's quoting. Compatibilists generally claim that a person is free as long as he is free from any outer or inner compulsions that would prevent him from acting on his actual desires and intentions. So if you want a second scoop of ice cream and no one is forcing you to eat it, then eating a second scoop is fully demonstrative of your free will. The truth, however, is that people claim greater autonomy than this. So it goes on. So, what was your question?
So, what do you, if you were to defend Daniel Dennett in a compatibilist view, do you have to negate or do you have to reject the idea of a mechanical deterministic universe in order to accept that free will operating on a deeper level?
I have a couple things about that. First of all, I'm not educated enough on the subject to fully defend a compatibilist point of view, and Dennett is someone who would be much, better to read about that point of view than I am.
I'll call him up right now. We'll just get him on.
We should talk to him.
We'll call him. Right.
So, secondly, I think the strongest point is it's very hard to, I think, demonstrate actually that we do not have free will at all. I don't think Sam Harris has fully done that. Because the points that Sam Harris brings up don't fully convince me of it. Like, for example, that we don't have conscious access to our thoughts does not demonstrate to me that we do not have free will. I think you have to go a few steps further to actually demonstrate that we don't. And it's also hard to reproduce. For example, you have two given states of the universe, or even a given thing. It's really hard to say, okay, and you start that thing back up. And you see the two different results, or the one. It's hard to test that because it's hard to get such a perfect control system where you have one thing in one state, or a thought process in a state, repeat the exact same conditions, and then let it go.
Yeah, but
so it's really hard to produce that.
I don't think predictability is required, though. I think he's just talking about that simple mechanical universe concept. I mean, isn't that a fairly convincing argument?
But if you froze a mental state, right? And you watched it for the next 5 minutes after you unfroze it. Mm-hmm. And it behaves differently in one universe than it does in the first. Well, but I think that – go ahead.
But that wouldn't make sense. I mean, why are you bringing that up? I guess.
Because if you have two alternatives that you could go, then that's an indicator that there might be free will, right?
Well, if there's only an indicator that you're unable to measure something or unaware of something else to be measured.
Could be.
This is kind of like the escaping God idea, that there's always just something else you don't understand, right?
I suppose so, but then again, it also shows the difficulty. Like I said, I'm generally in favor of the idea of free will. Of not having free will. It just seems to be a very difficult proposition to actually prove to my satisfaction.
Well, it seems that free will is just as difficult, is it not? Or am I just coming at it from the other perspective?
No, I agree. That's a very difficult position to prove as well, and that's the reason I don't, fully invest in one. Although I lean towards the idea that we don't have free will whatsoever.
Right.
And there's actually, the book talks about this sort of idea of free will existing within a quantum state or quantum mechanics, kind of like I was sort of just discussing. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I feel like that's just a gigantic shot in the dark. I mean, is that not? Yeah. Like he even mentions that philosophers are looking to it for hope, but I mean, there's like the positions of electrons in electron clouds in the sea of ions that are metals might not necessarily have particular positions at any given time, but that doesn't imply that sea of ions, which is actually just making up a bolt in a machine that moves a lever up and down, that non-deterministic stuff is at such a small level, it doesn't actually affect the larger machine, really. And it could easily be that case with neurons and humans. I mean, it feels like grasping at straws.
Again,
I shouldn't be investigated, but
I feel like that is a possible source for that conclusion because you could change your decision just from one, synapse firing differently, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But again, I find that it's hard to put that either which way, right? I think it's a hard case either way to show that we have free will or not.
Why do you think people are obsessed with the idea of having free will? Why are people defending it so heavily?
Well, I mean, I think we mentioned it, or well, I mentioned it earlier. I think we spoke a little bit about it, but I mean, it serves a specific, some political interests and ideology from one perspective, and also religious ideology from another perspective. I mean, because when you talk about the idea of having free will, that means that you are in charge of your every decision. So therefore, people would be able to capitalize on your mistakes. If you fail, it's not the system. It's not any external influences. It is yourself that is inadequate as a human being. You haven't worked hard enough. So I think it fulfills a political ideology and a religious ideology to blame people for their behavior, when in a lot of cases they shouldn't even have that blame. At least, even if they should have that blame, people don't even take into consideration other factors that could lead to it.
I think there's a lot of ramifications that can be frightening too. For instance, if there really isn't free will and there's a reason for everything, and there's also, maybe this goes into another Sam Harris spoke about what's actually moral, the moral landscape, about how you can maybe determine what is or isn't moral. It actually kind of throws democracy in for a loop too, in some ways, because why did someone vote one way or another, and are they actually acting in their best interest? What's the definition of your best interest, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a whole rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think people find the notion of not having free will depressing, because
is that it?
I think you inherit, I think that's most of it. I think you sort of have this notion from if we don't have free will, that the illusion is so strong, and human agency is something that's a recurring theme forever. I mean, if you look back at the Greek tragedies, they all focus on human agency and the power of human agency. It's what makes us human. Yeah. If you look at Oedipus or any of the other tragedies, it has to do with your hamartia, your tragic action that sort of leads to your downfall.
At the same time, though, didn't they explore stories where you had the Deus Ex Machina or whatever, where you would just have, like God would just come down and posit some action, and you would have to deal with the consequences? Is that just a storytelling technique, or does that tell us anything about free will?
Maybe. I think it's Deus Ex Machina is mostly a storytelling technique where early authors weren't good enough at tying up plot holes, and so they would have I think that's actually what it is. Yeah. And so they wouldn't be able to tie up plot holes very well, so they would have Deus Ex Machina, God from machine, come down. So they'd have like Jupiter come down and be like, oh, sorry guys, here, this is all fixed up and tied up. And that's where you get the phrase. So I think that's mostly that. I think for the most part, well, there might be some truth to that, and there are. I think for the most part that those really sort of celebrate human agency, and I think that that's something that we always do. And so it's very depressing that something we identify as so human may or may not exist.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is that we have no control. I mean, that's scary to think that you have no control, that you're only witnessing what is happening. I mean, if you tell somebody that they have no free will, you are basically running on, they could interpret it as they're running on autopilot and just kind of witnessing everything that's going on.
Right, nihilism.
Yeah, and it could be self-defeating. You could put yourself in some type of depression, put yourself in like an existential crisis, just like, what am I doing? What does this all really mean then?
But maybe this is a problem of language, because when you tell someone that they have no control, they actually still have the exact same control they always thought they had. It's just that there's this sort of stronger concept of a deterministic control, which almost is deserving of another name, which is truly dictating their actions, but the thing is, if you view a lack of free will, if a lack of free will to you means that you've lost something, then you don't understand the concept. Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, I understand. And to be honest with you, I mean, that's where Harris's position and compatibilist, they kind of differ, and he calls it a bait and switch, because he says that they trade the psychological fact which is the subjective experience of being a conscious agent for a conceptual understanding of ourselves as a person. So we have these two things, just like you said. One being, understanding who you are and what you're doing should be called something else, as opposed to understanding why you're doing it.
Harris brings up a good point that I do want to just quote him on, which I think will be interesting for the atheists out there. But that he writes, "This shift in understanding represents progress toward a deeper, more consistent, and more compassionate view of our common humanity, and we should note that this is progress away from religious metaphysics. Few concepts have offered greater scope for human cruelty than the idea of an immortal soul that stands independent of all material influences ranging from genes to economic systems. Within a religious framework, a belief in free will supports the notion of sin, which seems to justify not only harsh punishment in this life, but eternal punishment in the next. And yet, ironically, one of the fears attending our progress in science is that a more complete understanding of ourselves will dehumanize us." Which I think is interesting, that our fears about our own progression don't actually match the results we're getting from it.
I like that.
Yeah, there was another study that he talks about where subjects would read an argument about the existence of free will. Actually, the thing they would read would be against the notion, right? So saying that there is no free will. And then basically that made them more likely to cheat on a subsequent exam in the study. So after listening to this, don't go cheat on things.
I want to say too in closing, and this is, I apologize for the people who haven't read the book, but there are a number of cases in the book, and I'm curious if you guys caught this, where Harris is clearly, and maybe this is some sort of meta understanding of free will, but where he's clearly using his immediate surroundings in order to create examples for what he's talking about. For instance, he mentions how he might be annoyed at, say, a leaf blower outside the house, and it's like, I wonder where that came from, or he goes, if I drink a glass of water and instead choose a beer, it's like, I wonder what's going on right now while you're writing these words. Like, he sort of insta-tweets what he's doing as he writes.
Yeah, even to the end, the last line.
Even to, I thought the ending of the book was pretty weak, but, that's okay.
I think it's quirky and sort of makes a...
It's cute, I guess, yeah. He ends with I'm hungry or something like that.
Yeah.
It's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was all right.
Yeah. In fact, I can't think of anything else to say on the subject, and where's the freedom in that? Like, oh, come on.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so
He's kind of driving
Disney.
it home.
Yeah.
He's driving it home.
Would you, so for the listeners, I would, if this is an interesting topic, I would recommend Sam Harris's book on free will. Would you guys?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I think that especially if you're not familiar with the concepts of free will whatsoever, that you should give it a read. I think it's a good starting point and accessible, because I think a lot of times when you read arguments about free will, it's sort of inaccessible, and I think this is pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it can get philosophical quickly.
Really quickly.
Your eyes can glaze over with having prerequisites that are 1,000-page tomes of philosophy, and yeah.
Right. So I think this is very accessible even to myself. I like it for that reason. I don't think he fully states everything, or think he oversteps at times as well. But it's a good start, and I liked it. Yeah, I do think he is a good writer. And I think he's actually an excellent speaker as well, if you haven't seen any of his stuff. And I love his debate with Craig. So it's Harris and Craig on what is it? Something about Christ, I think. I don't remember, but it was a great debate. William Lane Craig and Sam Harris. And I think he's a great speaker as well. I wish he didn't have things that I disagree with him about so much in other areas, but that's how people are, like I tell people I loved Hitchens, and people say, really? You liked him? And you have to recognize people aren't some sort of monolithic deity that you pray to and you accept all things that they do and say. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Again, I'm Tom, and I was joined by Chris Thielen and Chris Lazare. This is episode 103. You can find notes for the show at AnAmericanAtheist.org/episode 103. Please leave us feedback through the contact button, and you can rate us on iTunes. We really appreciate that. It means a lot. And if you have any suggestions for stuff we should talk about on the show, feel free to send us that as well. And we'll try and be back, hopefully, in the near future with a fairly short show for the holidays. Thanks a lot for listening.